obviously I think that violence against women is a critical issue for South Africa. We have some of the highest rates of violence in the world, and that not only affects individual women in and of themselves, but it affects families, it affects children, it affects children's ability to learn, it affects children's ability to understand what it means to live in a violence-free society. And so that has a terrible knock-on effect. When we think of domestic violence, we think of it happening between one perpetrator and one victim. But in fact, children living in the home, other family members living in homes. We know that in South Africa, much of our population lives in multi-family dwellings, in communities. The knock-on effect of the experience of violence is very significant. I think in South Africa we've become so immune to violence that we're not surprised when we see graphic images, when we hear terribly graphic stories. And I think that we don't often account for the way that those cumulative effects weigh on South Africans. In terms of sexual violence, I think we live in a culture of rape. I think we are no longer surprised when we know somebody who's been the victim of sexual violence. I think we engage in a lot of victim blaming as a society. When we hear that something has happened to someone, we immediately leap to questions about who were they with, why were they there, why were they wearing what they were wearing. And yet we don't leap to the same kind of questions about why did the rapist rape. Much of our prevention messaging is about protecting yourself from sexual violence, whereas I think I would certainly like to see the message shifting to how can you prevent yourself from being an offender of sexual violence. So I think that all of that, all of the combined kind of complacency with which we've just come to accept the levels of violence that we experience, it for me is problematic, and I think we need to open a conversation about how we move towards preventing that violence rather than always responding. I feel like it's become much more usual for us in debates. If you think of when the Anine Boyson's case happened, people called for harsher sentences, bring back the death penalty, castrate rapists, all of these, what are the police doing? Reinstate sexual offences courts, and those are all part of the response. But I think there is a pre-step to that, in that what are we doing to prevent the violence in the first place? And for me, that's where our conversation critically needs to move. So for me, 16 days is always something that I feel very conflicted about. On the one hand, I really celebrate the fact that we do have 16 days where we do try to be more mindful of the situation within which most South African women find themselves. Unfortunately for me, I think it's become one of those kind of, slacktivism opportunities where we can wear our purple t-shirt or our pink shirt or go and do work at a shelter for 16 hours or all of these, very well-meaning initiatives, but which don't really contribute to much long-term or sustained attention to the subject. I really wish people would be more mindful of what they, on an everyday basis, as one individual person might be able to do in shifting some of those norms that are so accepting of sexual violence or violence against women. I think that having those kind of processes are really helpful in framing the debate and kind of pushing for an agenda change. I think the problem, though, is in cascading that down to a very real level. What have the SDGs or the MDGs actually meant for women who are living in contexts of violence? I don't think they've meant much. In terms of being able to push government to make good on commitments that they've made, I don't think they've been especially helpful. One of the key problems, I think, is that there's an inability to be able to take information from kind of, that's generated, for example, by service providers, by NGOs, by civil society, and really translate that into a policy platform that happens at such a high level. So even if you think of Commission on the Status of Women, the African Union, for example, the SADC region, there's so much evidence that's generated at a local level about what works, and yet that doesn't really make it upstream into policy and then again has that additional level of difficulty when it comes to accountability. So in terms of really, pushing governments to stand by commitments, to make commitments real, to ensure that there's sufficient budgeting for the kinds of commitments that they've made, the kinds of programs that they hope to see, the kind of change they hope to see. I think that's where the problem really gets stuck. And I think it's very unclear as to how we as civil society push that agenda anywhere, not even in a positive direction. I feel like there's really been a shutdown of access and opportunity. So while as civil society we are always in essence preaching to the choir between and among ourselves, there really doesn't seem to be any kind of inroad for that evidence into kind of government thinking and into making any change.